Imagine a world where the ground shudders under the weight of an apex predator, where the air itself seems to vibrate with the sheer power of an approaching killer. For decades, popular culture painted these creatures as slow, dim-witted, cold-blooded reptiles dragging their tails through ancient mud. That image is utterly false. The reality is far more terrifying and profoundly fascinating. These were hyper-lethal, warm-blooded biological machines, engineered over millions of years by the ruthless forces of natural selection to do exactly one thing: dominate. Today, we will learn about why dinosaurs were the most dangerous hunters of all time. Their supreme reign was not merely a product of massive size or brute strength. Instead, it was forged through millions of years of exquisite anatomical refinement, flawless environmental adaptation, and sensory capabilities that rival or exceed anything alive today. From razor-sharp serrated teeth designed to slice through living flesh with terrifying efficiency, to the biomechanical perfection of a bipedal stride that allowed them to run down prey with endless stamina, carnivorous dinosaurs were the undisputed masters of their domains for over 165 million years. We're going to explore the ultimate evolutionary arms race, unpacking the terrifying brainpower, the advanced pack hunting strategies, and the physiological marvels that made them the ultimate apex predators across every single continent. If you enjoy this scientific deep dive into prehistoric perfection, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel if you want to see more. Also, drop a comment below letting us know exactly where in the world you are and what time it is right now while you're tuning in to watch this. Now, let us step back into the deep past and witness the dawn of the ultimate killers. To truly understand the supreme lethality of carnivorous dinosaurs, we must first examine the biological weaponry that made their dominance possible. The predatory theropods were not merely overgrown lizards with sharp points in their mouths. They were the beneficiaries of millions of years of anatomical refinement, resulting in cutting and piercing tools that defied the limits of biological engineering. Two of the most devastating innovations in their evolutionary arsenal were their xiphodont dentition, meaning sword-like teeth, and the biomechanically perfect sickle claws found on the feet of specific hunting families. Let us dissect the science of this ancient weaponry, starting with the very instruments of consumption, the teeth. When we look at the jaws of large apex predators, we are looking at a masterclass in the physics of cutting. The classic theropod tooth is laterally compressed, meaning it is flattened from side to side rather than conical, and it curves slightly backward toward the throat. This basic shape alone is mechanically advantageous for slicing through flesh, while preventing struggling prey from escaping forward. However, the true terror of these teeth lies in their microscopic edges. Both the front and back edges of these curved blades were lined with tiny regular serrations called denticles, effectively turning every single tooth into a biological steak knife. For decades, paleontologists understood that these serrations helped tear through meat, but it was not until the advent of high-powered scanning electron microscopes that the true genius of theropod tooth design was revealed. Scientists examining the serrations of large predators discovered a microscopic feature hidden within the enamel. At the base of the groove between each individual serration, there is a tiny, flask-shaped void known as an ampulla. To a structural engineer, this is a profound discovery. When a predator bites down with immense force and the tooth encounters violent resistance, such as hitting a solid bone, the mechanical stress concentrates at the deepest part of the serration grooves. In an ordinary tooth, this concentrated stress would cause a microscopic crack to form and immediately propagate straight through the dentine, shattering the tooth completely. But the theropods evolved a mechanism to defeat this. The ampulla acts as a stress distributor. When the force hits that rounded void, the mechanical energy is dissipated across a wider microscopic surface area, stopping the crack dead in its tracks. This is the exact same physical principle that modern aerospace engineers use when designing airplane fuselages. They drill rounded holes at the ends of stress fractures to prevent the metal from tearing further. Dinosaurs evolved this structural engineering solution tens of millions of years before humans even existed. The physical mechanics of how these teeth operated during a bite are equally fascinating. A serrated edge does not simply push through material, it operates on the principle of concentrating force. Pressure equals force divided by the area over which it's applied. Because the tips of the denticles represent an incredibly minuscule surface area, the massive bite force of the dinosaur's jaw muscles was concentrated into microscopic points. As the jaw closed and the predator pulled its head backward in a specialized motion known as puncture and pull, the serrations would drag across the muscle and connective tissue of the prey. The points of the denticles would snag the strong fibrous collagen proteins of the victim's hide, pulling them taut before the razor-thin valleys between the serrations sliced through them. This resulted in a shockingly clean and devastatingly deep cut, maximizing blood loss and tissue damage, while minimizing the amount of energy the predator had to expend. Furthermore, these ultimate biological blades were constantly being replaced. A theropod could replace its entire set of teeth every 1 to 2 years, ensuring that its primary weapons never grew dull. Moving away from the mouth, we encounter another terrifying marvel of predatory biomechanics, the sickle claw. While many theropods relied almost entirely on their jaws, the dromaeosaurs, widely known to the public as raptors, developed an entirely different method of delivering lethal force. Their primary weapon was located on the second digit of their feet. This digit possessed a highly specialized bone called an ungual, which was radically curved and possessed a large pivot point. But the bone fossil we see in museums is only half the story. In life, this bony core was covered by a dense sheath of keratin, the same tough protein that makes up bird beaks and human fingernails. This keratin sheath extended far beyond the bone, tapering to an incredibly sharp needle-like point, and curving even more dramatically. For years, popular media depicted these sickle claws as biological scythes, imagining that the raptors would leap into the air and slash the bellies of their prey open, disemboweling them in a single sweeping kick. However, the physical mechanics of the claw and the joints of the foot tell a very different and far more scientifically accurate story. When biomechanical engineers and paleontologists tested the structural integrity of the claw, they discovered that while the tip was incredibly sharp for piercing, the inner curve of the claw was completely rounded, lacking a sharp cutting edge. Furthermore, the mechanics of a slashing motion require a high degree of lateral stability to prevent the blade from twisting and snapping when dragged through dense muscle and bone. The foot of a dromaeosaur, however, was not designed to withstand sideways torsional forces. Instead, it was built for pure, unadulterated vertical piercing. The secret to the claw's power lies in the principle of mechanical leverage. At the base of the ungual bone there is a prominent bony protrusion called the flexor tubercle. This served as the anchor point for a massive thick tendon that connected to the powerful flexor muscles in the dinosaur's calf. In physics, this setup operates as a biological lever. The joint of the toe acts as the fulcrum, and the flexor tubercle acts as the lever arm. Because the tubercle is situated relatively far from the pivot point of the joint, it grants a massive mechanical advantage. When the calf muscle contracted, it pulled the tendon, which cranked the claw downward with astonishing force. When a raptor struck, it did not slash. It drove its foot forward, and the needle-sharp point of the keratin sheath made contact with the prey's hide. Again, the physics of pressure came into play. The sheer kinetic energy of the dinosaur's leg, combined with the extreme leverage of the flexor tendon, was concentrated entirely onto a tip measuring only fractions of a millimetre across. The resulting pressure was astronomical, easily overcoming the structural yield strength of dinosaur scales and thick skin. The claw would puncture deep into the flesh. Once the claw was buried, the extreme curvature proved its true purpose. It acted like a meat hook, or a mountaineer's crampon. The dinosaur would lock its toe joints, and the curved claw would hook securely around the internal bones and dense muscle tissue of the prey, creating an unbreakable grip. This anatomy reveals that the sickle claw was not a sword for slashing, but a devastatingly effective grappling hook designed to puncture and hold. The joint connecting this toe to the rest of the foot, known as a zingally-moid articulation, was specifically evolved to allow a massive degree of rotation. The claw could be held completely off the ground in a hyperextended position to keep the precious point from being dulled against rocks and dirt while running. When the moment to strike arrived, the joint allowed the claw to arc downward through more than 160 degrees of motion, burying itself deep into the victim. Through these profound anatomical adaptations, from the stress-dissipating ampullae hidden within the serrations of their teeth, to the leverage-maximizing pivot joints of their sickle claws, carnivorous dinosaurs optimized the transfer of physical energy into living flesh. They were governed by the inescapable laws of physics, yet through millions of years of evolution, they manipulated leverage, pressure, and material science to become the most perfectly equipped hunters the planet has ever seen. While teeth and claws are the instruments of death, a weapon is only as dangerous as the machine wielding it. To truly comprehend why theropod dinosaurs were the absolute pinnacle of terrestrial predators, we must look past their terrifying weaponry and examine the biological engine that drove them. Two specific evolutionary innovations separated them from everything that came before and everything that has come since: the biomechanical perfection of obligate bipedalism and a highly advanced biological air sac system that provided virtually limitless stamina. By comparing the locomotion and respiration of these ancient hunters to modern four-legged mammalian predators, the terrifying superiority of the dinosaurian design becomes brilliantly clear. Consider the apex predators of our modern world, such as the lion, the cheetah, or the grey wolf. These are magnificent hunters, but they are fundamentally restricted by their quadrupedal, or four-legged mammalian anatomy. When a mammalian predator sprints, its method of locomotion relies on a bounding gait. The animal must constantly flex and extend its spine, gathering its hind legs forward and throwing its front legs out in a violent, undulating motion. While this flexible spine allows for sudden bursts of incredible speed, as seen in the cheetah, it is an extremely energy-intensive process. Every time the spine flexes and extends, massive amounts of muscular energy are expended. Furthermore, this bounding motion directly interferes with the animal's ability to breathe. Mammals use a sheet of muscle called the diaphragm to pull air into their lungs. During a full-speed sprint, the internal organs crash back and forth against the diaphragm with every bound, forcing the animal to synchronize its breathing with its stride. A cheetah can only maintain its top speed for less than a minute before its biological engine completely overheats, forcing it to stop or risk dying from heat exhaustion and oxygen debt. Carnivorous dinosaurs fundamentally bypassed every single one of these mammalian design flaws through obligate bipedalism. They walked and ran exclusively on two legs, and their anatomical structure was completely different from a human standing upright. A theropod's spine was held horizontally, parallel to the ground. To maintain perfect balance, their massive muscular tails acted as a rigid cantilever, a counterbalance to the weight of their heavy torsos and enormous skulls. The centre of mass was positioned directly over the hips, specifically over a reinforced pelvic socket called the acetabulum. Because the torso and tail were held relatively stiff, a running theropod did not waste precious energy flexing its spine back and forth. Instead, the hips and legs did all the work, operating like a highly efficient set of biological pendulums swinging beneath a stabilized chassis. The primary engine of this forward propulsion was a massive structure known as the caudifemoralis longus muscle. In mammals, the muscles that pull the leg backward to generate forward thrust are located in the buttocks and the thighs. In theropod dinosaurs, this primary retractor muscle originated deep within the bones of the tail and attached directly to the back of the femur, or thigh bone. Because this muscle was anchored to the massive counterweight of the tail, it was exponentially larger and more powerful than anything found in a modern mammal. Every time the dinosaur's foot struck the ground, this colossal muscle contracted, pulling the leg backward with devastating mechanical leverage and rocketing the animal forward. This design allowed for immense speed, but more importantly, it allowed for astonishing efficiency. A theropod could maintain a rapid pursuit pace for miles without experiencing the catastrophic energy loss that forces a wolf or a lion to abandon a chase. Moreover, this bipedal stance elevated their heads high above the brush, granting them a superior vantage point to spot prey from great distances, while completely freeing their forelimbs to evolve into specialized tools for grasping, slashing, or holding prey. However, the most terrifying advantage these predators possessed was hidden entirely from the outside. No matter how efficient their legs were, sustained physical exertion requires massive amounts of oxygen. Here, the dinosaurs possessed an anatomical secret weapon that makes the respiratory system of modern mammals look painfully primitive. Mammals, including humans and wolves, breathe using a tidal respiratory system. Air is inhaled into the lungs through the trachea, the oxygen is absorbed by tiny sacs called alveoli, and then the carbon dioxide is exhaled back out through the exact same pathway. This two-way street creates a massive bottleneck. Fresh air mixes with stale, deoxygenated air, meaning mammalian lungs are never entirely filled with pure oxygen. Furthermore, gas exchange only happens during the inhalation phase. When a mammal exhales, its body is essentially taking a pause from absorbing oxygen. During an intense hunt, this inefficiency rapidly leads to a buildup of lactic acid and overwhelming fatigue. Theropod dinosaurs solved the oxygen crisis by evolving a unidirectional respiratory system, a marvel of biological engineering that they passed down to their modern descendants, the birds. Instead of simple, expandable lungs, carnivorous dinosaurs possessed relatively rigid lungs, connected to a complex network of thin-walled biological balloons known as air sacs. These air sacs extended throughout the animal's body cavity, and remarkably, they even invaded the skeletal system itself. Paleontologists find distinct hollow chambers and openings called pneumatic foramina in the vertebrae and ribs of theropod fossils. These holes are the exact places where the biological air sacs entered the bone during the animal's life. This intricate network of sacs acted as a series of sophisticated bellows, driving air in a continuous one-way loop through the lungs. The process operated on a two-breath cycle. When the dinosaur inhaled for the first time, fresh, highly oxygenated air bypassed the lungs entirely and flowed straight into the posterior air sacs situated toward the back of the body. When the animal exhaled, this fresh air was pushed forward out of the posterior sacs and completely filled the rigid lungs. Inside the lungs, the air flowed through microscopic tubes called parabronchi, where a continuous cross-current blood flow extracted the oxygen with supreme efficiency. Then, upon the second inhalation, that now stale air was pushed out of the lungs and into the anterior air sacs located near the front of the body, while a brand new batch of fresh air simultaneously filled the rear sacs. Finally, on the second exhalation, the stale air from the front sacs was expelled out of the windpipe. This highly complex plumbing system yielded an absolutely terrifying biological advantage, a continuous, uninterrupted flow of oxygen. Unlike a mammal that only extracts oxygen when breathing in, a theropod dinosaur was extracting maximum oxygen from fresh air while inhaling and while exhaling. Their lungs were continuously bathed in fresh oxygen, completely eliminating the dead space and stale air mixing that limits mammalian stamina. The implications of this system for a super predator are staggering. A dinosaur could sprint, fight, and tear through flesh with a heart rate soaring, yet its muscles would never starve for oxygen. They were immune to the rapid exhaustion that plagues lions and tigers. If a hunt turned into a grueling, miles-long marathon of attrition, the dinosaur's unidirectional respiratory system ensured it would always outlast its prey. Furthermore, this internal network of air sacs served a crucial secondary function. The physical act of moving massive volumes of air through the body cavity acted as an internal radiator. Warm-blooded animals generate enormous amounts of metabolic heat during extreme physical exertion. While a heavily muscled mammalian predator might suffer a fatal heat stroke from chasing prey too far in a warm climate, The continuous internal breeze circulating through a theropod's air sacs vented excess heat directly out of its core, keeping the biological engine perfectly cooled. Finally, the invasion of these air sacs into the skeleton created a framework of pneumatic bones that were simultaneously massive, yet astonishingly lightweight. By hollowing out the heavy vertebrae and replacing solid bone with air, the theropod drastically reduced its overall body mass without sacrificing any structural integrity. This allowed them to grow to titanic proportions while remaining fast, agile, and relatively light on their feet. When you combine the biomechanical leverage of the caudifemoralis muscle, the energy conservation of a stabilized bipedal stride, the immense weight reduction of hollow bones, and a respiratory system that delivered a never-ending supply of oxygen, you're not just looking at a successful animal. You're looking at an indefatigable engine of destruction, a predator capable of hunting longer, running farther, and fighting harder than any mammalian carnivore in the history of the Earth. The reign of the carnivorous dinosaurs was not an overnight conquest. It was the result of a brutal, unforgiving evolutionary arms race that spanned tens of millions of years. To understand how these predators achieved their ultimate lethal perfection, we must rewind the biological clock to the harsh, arid deserts of the Triassic period, over 230 million years ago. At this dawn of the dinosaur era, the first theropods were far from the towering titans of popular imagination. They were the underdogs of their ecosystem. Species like Chelophasis and Herrerasaurus were small, lightly built, and typically measured no more than 2 to 3 meters from snout to tail. In a world dominated by massive armored reptilian predators known as Rauisuchians, these early dinosaurs survived not through brute strength, but through the supreme biomechanical advantages of their obligate bipedalism and their rapid, warm-blooded metabolism. These pioneer theropods possessed ultra-lightweight skeletons constructed of hollow bones, allowing them to accelerate to staggering speeds and maneuver with erratic agility. Their jaws were lined with dozens of small needle-like serrated teeth designed for snapping up insects, early mammals, and small reptiles. Because resources in the supercontinent of Pangaea were scarce, their hyper-efficient unidirectional lung systems gave them the stamina to forage tirelessly across vast distances without succumbing to exhaustion. However, the true test of their evolutionary lineage arrived approximately 201 million years ago, at the catastrophic boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic periods. Massive volcanic eruptions split the supercontinent apart, triggering apocalyptic climate change that wiped out over 3/4 of all life on Earth. The massive, slow-moving reptilian apex predators of the Triassic suffocated and starved. But the small, adaptable, metabolically efficient theropod dinosaurs survived the apocalypse. When the skies finally cleared, the Jurassic period began, bringing with it a dramatically different global climate. The arid deserts gave way to lush, sprawling forests of towering conifers, ferns and cycads. With a limitless buffet of vegetation now available, the herbivorous dinosaurs engaged in a massive evolutionary growth spurt to accommodate the giant digestive tracts needed to process thousands of kilograms of tough plant matter. This gave rise to the sauropods, the iconic long-necked dinosaurs like Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus, which rapidly evolved into walking biological mountains weighing upwards of 30 to 40 metric tons. According to the strict laws of evolutionary biology, when the prey scales up, the predator must scale up to match or face starvation. Thus began the first great arms race of the dinosaur age. The small, nimble hunters of the Triassic were forced to evolve into the giant killers of the Jurassic. As the Jurassic progressed, the theropod lineage split and diversified, producing massive, robust predators like Megalosaurus, Torvosaurus, and the horned Ceratosaurus. But the absolute pinnacle of Jurassic terror, the apex predator that fundamentally redefined the mechanics of dinosaurian hunting, was Allosaurus. Measuring up to 9 meters long and weighing over 2 metric tons, Allosaurus was a masterclass in predatory engineering, specifically designed to dismantle the largest terrestrial animals that had ever walked the Earth. However, When paleontologists first subjected the skull of Allosaurus to rigorous biomechanical analysis and finite element modelling, the same structural testing used by engineers to design bridges and skyscrapers, they encountered a baffling scientific paradox. The computer models calculated the maximum bite force of Allosaurus based on the attachment points and volumes of its jaw muscles. The results were shockingly low. Allosaurus could only generate a bite force of approximately 2,000 to 8,000 newtons. To put that into perspective, an 8,000 newton bite is weaker than the bite of a modern American alligator, an animal that is a fraction of the dinosaur's size. How could a 2-ton apex predator armed with a bite weaker than an alligator possibly hope to kill a gigantic sauropod weighing 20 times its own mass? The answer lay not in the strength of the jaw muscles, but in the radical structural engineering of the skull itself and a terrifying hunting strategy known as the hatchet bite. If you examine the skull of a modern mammalian predator like a lion or a wolf, you will see a solid, heavy dome of bone designed to withstand the immense crushing pressures generated by their jaw muscles. The skull of Allosaurus was built on an entirely different physical paradigm. Instead of solid bone, its massive skull was hollowed out by enormous weight-saving holes called antorbital fenestrae. The remaining bone acted as a framework of rigid struts, similar to the steel scaffolding of a modern crane. This made the skull of Allosaurus astonishingly lightweight, relative to its massive size. Furthermore, the joints connecting the bones of the skull were not entirely fused together. They possessed a high degree of cranial kinesis, meaning the bones could subtly slide, flex, and bow against one another. At the back of this lightweight, flexible skull attached a network of colossal, highly specialized neck muscles, specifically the longissimus capitis superficialis. These muscles were anchored to the heavy vertebrae of the neck and shoulders, providing enormous leverage. Biomechanical physicists realized that Allosaurus was not using its jaws like a pair of crushing pliers. It was using its entire head like a medieval battle axe. The incredibly light weight of the skull reduced its moment of inertia, meaning the massive neck muscles could accelerate the head downward with blinding speed. When Allosaurus attacked a massive herbivore, it did not attempt to bite down and crush the bones. Instead, it opened its jaws to an absolutely terrifying angle. Because of a specialized articulation in the jaw joint, Allosaurus could gape its mouth open up to 90 degrees, and potentially even wider, completely clearing its lower jaw out of the way. With its massive mouth wide open, exposing a terrifying array of recurved, serrated teeth, the dinosaur fired its powerful neck muscles, driving its upper jaw downward into the flesh of the prey like a biological hatchet. The physics of this strike were devastating. The kinetic energy generated by the massive neck muscles, combined with the extreme velocity of the lightweight skull, transferred massive amounts of force into the extremely small surface area of the tooth tips. This astronomical pressure caused the razor-sharp teeth to instantly puncture the thick hide and bury themselves deep into the muscle tissue of the victim. But what happened to the skull upon impact? If a solid bone skull was swung into a heavy object with that much force, the sheer shock wave of the sudden deceleration would shatter the predator's own brain case. This is exactly where the genius of the Allosaurus skull design comes into play. The structural struts and the highly kinetic, flexible joints between the skull bones acted as an advanced biological shock absorption system. As the teeth slammed into the prey, the impact energy travelled up through the teeth and was instantly dissipated throughout the flexible joints of the skull, preventing the bones from fracturing under the immense stress. The violence did not stop with the initial impact. The moment the upper teeth were buried deep into the victim, the Allosaurus executed the second phase of the hatchet bite. It used the colossal power of its bipedal legs to brace against the ground, and it pulled its entire body backward with explosive force. The backward curving shape of the teeth acted like meat hooks. Because the prey was massive, often weighing tens of thousands of kilograms, it possessed immense physical inertia. It could not easily be dragged backward. Therefore, as the predator pulled its head away, the serrated edges of the teeth ripped violently through the flesh, slicing through muscle fibers, severing major arteries, and carving massive gaping trenches out of the living animal. This strike and tear strategy was a brilliant evolutionary solution to the problem of hunting colossal prey. An Allosaurus could not wrestle a massive Brachiosaurus or Stegosaurus to the ground. A single blow from a sauropod's tail, travelling at speeds approaching the sound barrier, could shatter a predator's ribs and shatter its internal organs. Engaging in a prolonged grappling match was biological suicide. The hatchet bite allowed Allosaurus to utilise hit-and-run tactics. It would rush in at high speed, swing its skull downward to deliver a devastating, flesh-ripping blow, and immediately retreat to a safe distance before the massive prey could retaliate. The goal of this attack was not instant death. It was a calculated application of hemorrhagic shock. By repeatedly inflicting massive bleeding wounds, the predator forced the prey to bleed out. The heart of a 30-ton dinosaur had to pump thousands of litres of blood at enormous pressures just to fight gravity and keep oxygen flowing to its brain. When major arteries in the flanks or legs were severed by the hatchet bite, the massive cardiovascular system of the prey worked against it, pumping its own lifeblood out onto the Jurassic soil at an astonishing rate. The Allosaurus merely had to follow the bleeding titan, utilising its highly efficient respiratory system to maintain a relentless, effortless pace, until the massive herbivore eventually succumbed to massive blood loss, systemic shock and exhaustion. Furthermore, fossil evidence suggests that these Jurassic apex predators did not always hunt alone. Paleontologists have uncovered massive bone beds containing the remains of multiple Allosaurus individuals of varying ages, alongside the heavily scavenged bones of massive sauropods. While they may not have hunted with the highly coordinated militaristic precision of modern wolf packs, the evidence strongly points to complex mobbing behaviour. Multiple predators attacking a single giant simultaneously, repeatedly delivering debilitating hatchet bites to the flanks and legs, would exponentially accelerate the rate of blood loss and overwhelm the defences of even the largest terrestrial titans. By the end of the Jurassic period, the evolutionary arms race had produced a perfect equilibrium of terror. The massive herbivores had evolved immense size, armour plates, and lethal defensive weapons, but the theropods had counter-evolved with sophisticated biomechanical engineering. They had transformed their skulls from simple biting apparatuses into highly kinetic, shock-absorbing kinetic weapons, allowing them to extract maximum biological devastation while minimising their own physical risk. Yet, the supremacy of Allosaurus was only a single chapter in the history of dinosaurian dominance. As the planet's tectonic plates continued to shift, tearing the supercontinent entirely apart and completely isolating the northern and southern hemispheres, the stage was set for the evolution of even more specialised, bizarre, and terrifying engines of destruction. The arms race was about to expand across the globe. As the Jurassic period gave way to the Cretaceous period over 145 million years ago, the biological stage for the ultimate predatory arms race underwent a massive geographical upheaval. The colossal supercontinent of Pangaea began to violently tear itself apart, driven by the relentless churning of the Earth's tectonic plates. A vast, impenetrable ocean began to flood the widening rift, physically severing the northern landmass known as Laurasia from the sprawling southern landmass known as Gondwana. This geological divorce effectively split the terrestrial biosphere in half. In the isolated northern hemisphere, the evolutionary trajectory of apex predators would eventually culminate in the towering, bone-crushing tyrannosaurs. But in the southern hemisphere, a vast expanse that would eventually fracture into modern-day South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, and Antarctica, the evolutionary laboratory produced an entirely different, incredibly bizarre, and devastatingly lethal dynasty of killers, the Abelisaurids. To comprehend the sheer alien lethality of the Abelisaurids, one must forget everything they know about the classic theropod silhouette. If the northern tyrannosaurs were the heavy artillery of the Cretaceous, the Abelisaurids were the high-speed ballistic missiles. The undisputed poster child for this terrifying family is Carnotaurus, a name that literally translates to meat-eating bull. Discovered in the ancient floodplains of South America, Carnotaurus and its relatives, such as Majungasaurus from Madagascar, represent a radical departure in biomechanical engineering, specifically designed to dominate the unique ecosystems of the Gondwanan supercontinent. The most visually shocking adaptation of the Abelisaurids is their cranial architecture. While the predators of the north evolved elongated, massive snouts, the Abelisaurids evolved drastically foreshortened, exceptionally deep and heavily armoured skulls. To the untrained eye, they look almost like the reptilian equivalents of modern bulldog breeds. However, this foreshortened snout was not an evolutionary accident. It was a masterful exploitation of physical lever mechanics. In biomechanical physics, the jaw operates as a lever system, with the jaw joint acting as the fulcrum. When a predator possesses a very long snout, the distance from the jaw muscles to the front teeth is vast. This provides a great reach, but it makes the jaws highly susceptible to torsional stress, meaning if a massive prey animal violently twists and thrashes while gripped in the front teeth, the long thin snout could suffer catastrophic structural failure and snap. The Abelisaurids solved this problem by drastically shortening the lever arm. By compressing the skull longitudinally and deepening it vertically, they created a solid, compact fortress of bone that was practically immune to sideways torsion. Furthermore, this shortened lever arm meant that the lower jaw had far less distance to travel when snapping shut. While their bite force was not designed to crush solid bone like a tyrannosaur, the closing velocity of an Abelisaurid's jaws was absolutely blinding. When they struck, their jaws slammed shut with the speed of a springing steel trap. This highly robust, compact skull was anchored to a spectacularly thick, heavily muscled neck. The biomechanical evidence suggests a hunting strategy, heavily reliant on explosive kinetic impact and rapid tearing. The skull of Carnotaurus was rigidly fused, lacking the shock-absorbing flexibility seen in earlier Jurassic predators. Furthermore, the top of the skull was fortified with dense osteoderms and, in the case of Carnotaurus, two massive, thick, bony horns projecting from above the eyes. These reinforced craniums indicate that these predators were capable of utilizing their entire heads as blunt force weapons. They could accelerate their bodies to extreme velocities and use their armoured skulls to physically ram into their prey, using the sheer concussive shock of the impact to shatter ribs and knock swift-moving victims entirely off their feet before delivering rapid, flesh-tearing bites and violently twisting their massive necks to rip away huge chunks of muscle. To further optimize this biological missile design, evolution initiated a radical process of anatomical reduction regarding their upper limbs. While the arms of a Tyrannosaurus Rex are famously small, the forelimbs of the Abelisaurids border on the absurd. The arms of Carnotaurus were so vestigial, so profoundly reduced, that they lacked functional elbow or wrist joints altogether. Their 4 tiny digits were completely immobilized, pointing backward in a permanent fused position. To a casual observer, these pathetic appendages seem like a cruel evolutionary joke, but in the realm of high-speed biomechanics, they represent a stroke of genius. Every single gram of bone and muscle located at the front of a bipedal animal pulls its center of mass forward. By completely discarding their forelimbs, the Abelisaurids drastically reduced the weight of their anterior torso. This critical mass reduction allowed them to shift their center of gravity further backward, perfectly positioning it over their hips. This rearward weight distribution freed up the evolutionary capital needed to invest entirely in their ultimate weapon, the most colossal, overpowered locomotor engine the dinosaur kingdom had ever seen. The true terrifying majesty of Carnotaurus lies in its hindquarters, specifically the radical bioengineering of its tail and thigh muscles. To understand how this predator achieved unparalleled speeds, we must examine the hyper-specialized anatomy of its caudal vertebrae, the bones that make up the tail. In a standard theropod dinosaur, the tail acts as dynamic counterbalance. It swings side to side and flexes up and down to help the animal maintain balance, while executing complex maneuvers and sharp turns. The vertebrae possess small, laterally projecting bony struts called transverse processes, which serve as attachment points for muscles. In Carnotaurus, however, these transverse processes underwent an extreme evolutionary mutation. Instead of protruding straight out to the sides, the bony struts of the tail vertebrae were massively elongated and angled steeply upward in a prominent V-shape. Furthermore, the tips of these elongated struts physically interlocked with the vertebrae immediately in front of and behind them. This interlocking architectural design completely eliminated the flexibility of the anterior half of the tail. The tail of Carnotaurus was not a flexible whip. It was locked into a completely rigid, inflexible, solid bony rod extending straight out from the hips. In the ruthless calculus of natural selection, an animal does not sacrifice flexibility without gaining a massive advantage in return. The reward for this rigid tail was absolute, unadulterated horsepower. By locking the tailbones together, evolution created a massive, perfectly stable, incredibly expansive surface area for muscle attachment. The primary muscle responsible for pulling the leg backward and generating forward thrust in dinosaurs is the cauda femoralis longus. In Carnotaurus, this muscle was hypertrophied to an astonishing degree. Because of the expanded interlocking bony struts, the volume of space available to house this muscle was exponentially larger than in any other predatory dinosaur known to science. Biomechanical physicists and paleontologists utilizing advanced 3D digital muscle reconstruction algorithms have calculated the sheer mass of this locomotor engine. The estimates are staggering. The cauda femoralis muscle alone accounted for up to 15% of Carnotaurus's total body weight. In an animal weighing roughly 1.5 metric tons, you're looking at hundreds of kilograms of dense, pure, fast-twitch muscle fiber dedicated to exactly one task: explosive forward propulsion. When Carnotaurus initiated a sprint, these colossal muscular pistons contracted with terrifying force, pulling the massive femurs backward and launching the predator forward with an acceleration curve that would rival modern mammalian sprinters. They were the undisputed drag racers of the Cretaceous period, capable of achieving straight-line velocities that could easily exceed 50 km per hour. However, the rigid laws of physics demand a steep price for such extreme specialization. Because its tail was locked into a rigid rod to support its massive engine, Carnotaurus had completely sacrificed its biological steering wheel. When a flexible-tailed predator, like a modern cheetah or a velociraptor, executes a sharp, high-speed turn, it whips its tail in the opposite direction of the turn. This shifts the animal's center of mass, counteracting the immense rotational inertia and preventing the animal from losing its balance and wiping out. Carnotaurus was physically incapable of doing this. It was a biological bullet. It could launch itself forward with devastating speed, but if it attempted to alter its trajectory sharply while moving at top velocity, the rigid tail could not shift the center of mass. The massive lateral forces would instantly overcome the grip of its specialized foot pads, and the 1.5-ton predator would violently crash, potentially breaking its legs or its back in a high-speed tumble. This profound biomechanical trade-off paints a very specific picture of how these Gondwanan killers operated in their environment. They were not pursuit predators designed for weaving through dense, chaotic forests. They were highly specialized apex predators of the vast, open, arid floodplains of the southern continents. Their prey consisted of smaller, incredibly swift ornithopod dinosaurs that relied on speed to survive. The Abelisaurid hunting strategy was one of terrifying high-velocity ambush. A Carnotaurus would use its binocular vision to lock onto a target from a distance, calculating the exact trajectory required. It would wait for the perfect moment, and then, utilizing the colossal power of its hypermuscled tail and thighs, it would unleash a devastating straight-line sprint. The goal was to close the distance so rapidly that the prey simply did not have the reaction time necessary to initiate an evasive lateral turn. Before the victim could weave to the left or right, The 1.5-ton missile of muscle and bone would impact it at over 50 kilometers per hour. The predator would ram its armored, bulldog-like skull directly into the victim, simultaneously snapping its jaws shut with blinding speed to secure a grip, allowing the sheer kinetic energy of the impact to crush the prey instantly. Through millions of years of isolated evolution, Gondwana had taken the theropod blueprint and violently twisted it, sacrificing agility and versatile arms to forge a dynasty of hyper-specialized, rigid-spined speed demons that ruled the southern plains with absolute high-velocity terror. While the Abelisaurids were biologically engineered to be the high-speed ballistic missiles of the southern plains, they were only one part of the Gondwanan predatory equation. The southern hemisphere during the Cretaceous period was a land of unimaginable extremes. As the flowering plants began to take root and the environment flourished, the herbivorous dinosaurs of the south underwent a period of explosive evolutionary gigantism. This era gave rise to the titanosaurs, the absolute largest terrestrial animals to ever walk the surface of the earth. Species like Argentinosaurus and Patagotitan were walking mountains of flesh and bone, reaching staggering lengths of up to 35 meters and weighing anywhere from 70 to potentially 100 metric tons. When an ecosystem produces herbivores of such titanic proportions, the biological rules of predation are pushed to their absolute breaking point. A traditional predator cannot simply overpower an animal that outweighs it by a factor of 10. A physical wrestling match with a 100-ton titanosaur was practically a death sentence. A single misstep by the herbivore could crush a predator into the prehistoric dirt, and a defensive swing from a massive whip-like tail could shatter the predator's ribcage and obliterate its internal organs with the kinetic energy of a freight train. To conquer these impossible giants, the southern continents forged a completely different dynasty of killers, a lineage of colossal, hypercarnivorous theropods known as the Carcharodontosauridae. The name Carcharodontosauridae translates directly to shark-toothed lizards, and it is a beautifully apt description of their primary biological weaponry. This family includes some of the most massive predatory dinosaurs ever discovered, rivaling and in some dimensions even exceeding the northern Tyrannosaurus Rex. Giants like Giganotosaurus, Mappasaurus and the North African Carcharodontosaurus were the undisputed heavyweights of their respective domains. A fully grown Giganotosaurus could reach lengths of over 13 meters and weigh upwards of 8 metric tons. However, despite their massive size, their anatomical design and hunting strategies were completely antithetical to the bone-crushing methods of the tyrannosaurs. The Carcharodontosaurids were the ultimate practitioners of precision slaughter and catastrophic exsanguination. To understand their terrifying efficiency, we must examine the architectural design of their massive skulls. The skull of a Giganotosaurus was incredibly long, sometimes measuring over 1.6 meters from snout to the back of the head, making it one of the largest skulls of any known terrestrial predator. Yet, despite this massive volume, the skull was surprisingly lightweight. It was extensively pneumatic, meaning it was riddled with large hollow chambers and weight-saving openings. The bones forming the snout and the jaw were relatively thin and narrow compared to the massive blocky skull of a tyrannosaur. Biomechanical modelling reveals that this long, narrow skull was not built to withstand the immense torsional stress of gripping and holding onto a violently struggling prey animal, nor did it possess the robust muscular attachments necessary to crush dense bone. Instead, the jaws of the Carcharodontosaurids were designed for a much more sinister purpose: high-speed, catastrophic flesh slicing. Their mouths were armed with up to 60 enormous blade-like teeth, some measuring over 20 centimeters long. Unlike the thick banana-shaped bone-crushing teeth of later apex predators, Carcharodontosaurid teeth were heavily compressed laterally, making them astonishingly flat and thin, remarkably similar to the teeth of a great white shark. Both the front and rear edges of these biological blades were lined with aggressive deep serrations. These jaws were highly specialized cutting tools, powered by incredibly fast-twitch jaw muscles that allowed the predator to snap its mouth shut with blinding speed. The hunting strategy of these giant theropods was a masterpiece of lethal physics and biological exploitation. When confronting a massive titanosaur, a Giganotosaurus or Mapisaurus did not attempt to bite the neck or hold the animal down. Instead, they employed a terrifying hit-and-run tactic known as the slash-and-tear method. The predator would utilize its massive bipedal stride to close the distance on the slow-moving sauropod. Approaching from the rear or the flanks to avoid the massive stomping forelimbs, the Carcharodontosaurid would swing its massive head and deliver a rapid, devastating bite to the thick muscles of the titanosaur's hind legs or lower belly. Because the teeth were so thin and heavily serrated, they met almost zero physical resistance as they sliced through the thick leathery hide of the herbivore. The predator would violently jerk its massive skull backward, allowing the shark-like teeth to effortlessly carve massive, deep trenches of flesh from the living animal. The moment the damage was inflicted, the predator would instantly disengage and retreat to a safe distance, completely avoiding the defensive retaliations of the wounded giant. This is where the sheer genius of this hunting strategy is revealed, as the predator effectively weaponized the titanosaur's own cardiovascular system against it. To sustain a biological machine weighing nearly 100 metric tons, a titanosaur required an astonishingly powerful heart. To pump blood all the way up a neck that could reach 15 meters into the air, the animal's heart had to generate absolutely massive internal blood pressure, far exceeding anything seen in modern land animals. When the shark-toothed theropod carved a meter-long trench into the titanosaur's thigh, it invariably severed massively dilated veins and major femoral arteries. Because the internal blood pressure of the herbivore was so high, the severed arteries would violently rupture, spraying hundreds of liters of blood onto the prehistoric soil in a matter of minutes. The Carcharodontosaurids did not need to physically overpower their massive prey. They merely needed to inflict deep, bleeding wounds and let the unforgiving laws of fluid dynamics do the rest. The predators would simply follow the bleeding titan, utilizing their advanced unidirectional respiratory air sacs to effortlessly pace the dying giant. As the titanosaur lost massive volumes of blood, its blood pressure would begin to plummet precipitously. Deprived of oxygenated blood, the massive muscles of its legs would begin to fail, and the towering animal would inevitably collapse from catastrophic hemorrhagic shock. Once the mountain of meat was grounded and helpless, the predators could feed at their leisure. Furthermore, paleontology has provided chilling evidence that these southern giants were not solitary assassins, but highly coordinated mob hunters. In the Patagonia region of Argentina, scientists unearthed a massive bone bed containing the remains of at least 7 Mapisaurus individuals, ranging from young juveniles to massive, fully grown adults, all buried together in a single geological layer. The absence of other herbivorous dinosaur bones in this specific deposit strongly suggests that this was not a predator trap, but a family group or a gang that lived, hunted, and ultimately died together. The implications of this discovery are absolutely terrifying. If a single 13-meter Carcharodontosaurid was capable of carving lethal wounds into a titanosaur, a coordinated mob of 7 giant predators executing synchronized hit-and-run attacks would be an apocalyptic nightmare for the herbivores. The juveniles, being lighter and significantly faster, could dart in to harass the prey and inflict dozens of smaller lacerations, distracting the massive beast. Meanwhile, the multi-ton adults could step in to deliver the catastrophic deep tissue bites capable of severing the main arteries. By attacking in a coordinated mob, they exponentially increased the rate of blood loss and drastically reduced the time required to bring down the largest animals to ever exist. This incredible evolutionary adaptation demonstrates why the carnivorous dinosaurs were so dominant. They were not locked into a single method of killing. Through millions of years of natural selection, the theropod body plan proved to be infinitely adaptable. In the south, the environment demanded a solution to the problem of extreme gigantism, and evolution answered with the Carcharodontosauridae. Towering, bipedal, biological machines armed with shark-like jaws, operating in brutal, highly coordinated gangs to slowly dismantle walking mountains through the sheer terror of calculated exsanguination. They were the ultimate specialists of their time, perfectly designed to conquer a world of giants. While the southern hemisphere was dominated by the sheer devastating mass of the giant flesh-slicing Carcharodontosaurids and the high-velocity ballistic impacts of the Abelisaurids, a completely different paradigm of predation was evolving in the shadows of the Cretaceous period. In the evolutionary arms race, immense physical size and bone-crushing strength are not the only pathways to absolute lethality. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon an apex predator can wield is its mind. For decades, the public perception of dinosaur intelligence was woefully inaccurate, painting them as mindless biological automatons governed entirely by primitive, instinctual hardwiring. However, paleontological evidence paints a vastly different and far more terrifying picture, particularly when we examine the relatively small, highly agile predators belonging to the families Dromaeosauridae, commonly known as the raptors, and the closely related Troodontidae. These animals did not conquer their ecosystems through brute force. They weaponized cognitive processing, hyper-advanced sensory integration, and complex biomechanical grappling tactics. To scientifically quantify the intelligence of extinct organisms, paleontologists utilize a metric known as the encephalization quotient. This quotient is a mathematical formula that compares the actual brain mass of an animal to the predicted brain mass for an animal of its specific body size. To calculate this for a creature that has been dead for over 70 million years, scientists use high-resolution computed tomography scanners to map the inside of the fossilized brain case, creating a highly detailed three-dimensional digital cast called an endocast. This endocast reveals not just the overall volume of the brain, but the specific shapes and sizes of its individual neurological lobes. When researchers analysed the endocasts of the Troodontids and the Dromaeosaurids, the results were astonishing. These theropods possessed encephalization quotients that completely shattered the baseline for typical reptilian intelligence. Their brain-to-body mass ratios were significantly higher than those of modern crocodilians and scaled remarkably close to those of modern flightless birds, such as ostriches and certain predatory birds like hawks and eagles. While cinematic portrayals often exaggerate their intellect to rival that of chimpanzees or dolphins, the scientific reality is still incredibly formidable. A predator with the cognitive processing power of an eagle is an incredibly dangerous biological machine capable of spatial mapping, opportunistic problem-solving, and highly adaptive behavioral responses to a changing environment. This expanded brain volume was not uniformly distributed. The endocasts reveal massive hypertrophied expansions in specific neurological regions, most notably the cerebrum, which is responsible for advanced cognitive processing, and the optic lobes, which are dedicated to processing visual information. This brings us to the terrifying sensory coordination of these predators. The Dromaeosaurids possessed exceptionally large eyes that were physically rotated forward on their skulls. In standard prey animals, the eyes are positioned on the sides of the head to provide a wide, panoramic field of view to watch for danger. However, by evolving forward-facing eyes, these raptors sacrificed peripheral vision in exchange for a massive evolutionary advantage: binocular vision. Because the visual fields of their right and left eyes overlapped significantly in the front, their brains could process two slightly different images of the same object simultaneously. This neurological synthesis creates stereoscopic vision, granting the predator perfect three-dimensional depth perception. Just like a modern sniper utilizing a laser rangefinder, a velociraptor or a Deinonychus could instantly and mathematically calculate the precise distance to a moving target down to the millimeter, allowing them to time their high-speed strikes with flawless lethal accuracy. Furthermore, this hyper-advanced visual targeting system was hardwired into a masterclass of inner ear anatomy. Deep within the skull, dinosaurs possessed a vestibular system governed by semicircular canals, which dictate an animal's sense of balance and spatial orientation. In the highly agile Dromaeosaurids, these canals were immensely enlarged. This structural upgrade acted like an internal biological gyroscope of extreme sensitivity. It allowed these predators to execute rapid, acrobatic, high-speed maneuvers, violently changing direction mid-sprint, while keeping their heads and their forward-facing eyes perfectly stabilized and locked onto their prey. Their bodies could twist and torque through the air, but their visual targeting system remained absolutely undisturbed. With such advanced sensory integration and a large brain, the question of pack hunting immediately arises. Popular media has deeply ingrained the image of raptors hunting in highly organized, telepathic military formations, executing flanking maneuvers with the synchronized precision of mammalian wolf packs. However, modern paleontology urges caution regarding this mammalian comparison. The brains of theropod dinosaurs, while advanced, were structurally diapsid, meaning they were built on a reptilian and avian blueprint, lacking the neocortex that drives complex mammalian social hierarchies. The fossil evidence, such as the famous site where multiple Deinonychus individuals were found buried alongside a massive herbivorous Tyrannosaurus, certainly proves that these predators congregated and killed large prey together. However, instead of a highly organized wolf pack, scientists propose a model of coordinated mobbing, similar to the behavior seen in modern Komodo dragons, or massive flocks of carnivorous birds. In this scenario, multiple individuals are attracted to the same target, launching simultaneous opportunistic attacks. They are not necessarily working as a selfless coordinated military unit, but rather as a terrifying chaotic swarm of razor-sharp biomachinery that overwhelms the defences of a much larger animal through sheer relentless numbers and overlapping angles of attack. Whether hunting in a mob or executing a solitary strike, the actual method of killing utilised by the Dromaeosaurids was a masterpiece of specialised biomechanics, fundamentally challenging decades of assumptions. For years, it was assumed that a raptor would leap into the air and use the famous sickle claw on its foot to slash open the belly of its prey. However, as biomechanical engineers analysed the joints of the foot and the structural integrity of the claw, they realised it was not built for slicing. Instead, scientists have proposed the raptor-prey restraint model, a hunting strategy that is actually far more brutal and scientifically sound than the cinematic slashing theory. The raptor-prey restraint model suggests that the Dromaeosaurids hunted in a manner nearly identical to modern accipitrid birds of prey, such as eagles, hawks, and owls. When an eagle hunts, it does not bite its prey to death, nor does it slash it. The eagle uses its body weight and gravity to slam into the victim, pinning it forcefully to the ground. Then, it utilizes its massive curved talons to puncture deep into the flesh, locking its perfectly designed joints in place. The eagle effectively stands on top of the struggling victim, using the immense gripping power of its feet to restrict the prey's breathing and movement. Once the prey is securely pinned and incapacitated by the biological meat hooks, the eagle reaches down with its beak and begins to consume the animal while it is still alive. The skeletal anatomy of the Dromaeosaurids aligns perfectly with this exact model. The metatarsal bones in their feet were remarkably robust, designed to absorb the immense compressive shock of a downward impact. When a predator like Velociraptor struck an animal roughly its own size or slightly smaller, it would leap on top of the victim, utilizing the entirety of its body weight to pin the animal against the earth. The massive, hyperextensible second toe carrying the sickle claw would swing downward in a devastating arc, driven by the incredibly powerful calf muscles. The needle-sharp point of the keratin-sheathed claw would easily puncture the victim's thick hide. Because of the claw's extreme inner curvature, once it was driven deep into the muscle and bone, it acted like a biological anchor. The predator would lock its joints, ensuring that no amount of violent thrashing could dislodge its deadly grip. But pinning a violently struggling, desperate animal requires extreme balance. If the raptor was standing on top of its thrashing prey, how did it keep from being bucked off? This is where one of the most significant paleontological discoveries of the last century fundamentally rewrote our understanding of predatory biomechanics: the presence of pennaceous feathers. We now know with absolute scientific certainty that dromaeosaurids were completely covered in complex feathers, and their forelimb supported large, well-developed aerodynamic wings, despite the animals being far too massive for powered flight. These wings were not for flying. They were critical instruments of physical stabilization. In a biomechanical concept known as wing-assisted incline running, modern ground birds aggressively flap their wings to generate aerodynamic downforce, essentially pushing their bodies firmly against steep inclines to run up sheer vertical surfaces. The raptors repurposed this exact physical principle for the kill. While standing on top of their violently struggling prey, their sickle claws securely anchored deeply into the flesh, the predator would aggressively and continuously flap its large feathered wings. This massive expenditure of energy generated immense aerodynamic downforce, effectively using the physics of air pressure to pin the victim even tighter against the ground, completely neutralizing the prey's attempts to throw the predator off. The most magnificent and chilling confirmation of the raptor-prey restraint model was unearthed in the Gobi Desert in the 1970s, the legendary fighting dinosaurs fossil. This astonishing discovery froze a moment of prehistoric ultraviolence perfectly in time. The fossil consists of a predatory velociraptor locked in a deathmatch with a herbivorous protoceratops. A sudden collapsing sand dune buried them alive in the exact middle of their life or death struggle. When paleontologists meticulously prepared the fossil, the positioning of the bones was a revelation of predatory physics. The velociraptor was not slashing at the herbivore from a distance. The predator was physically intertwined with its prey in close quarters combat. Most critically, the sickle claw of the velociraptor's foot was found buried deep inside the throat region of the protoceratops, perfectly positioned to puncture the major carotid arteries and the trachea. Simultaneously, the velociraptor was utilizing its right arm to firmly grasp the heavy bony frill of the herbivore's skull, further securing its hold. This fossil is the ultimate undeniable proof of the grappling, pinning and puncturing mechanics of the dromaeosaurids. They did not need the bone-crushing bite force of a tyrannosaur because their jaws were relegated to a secondary role. Once the victim was immobilized under the sheer physical weight of the predator, pinned tightly to the ground by the aerodynamic downforce generated by the violent flapping of feathered wings, and paralyzed by the agonizing pain of massive sickle claws locked deep within its internal organs, the raptor would simply lean down. Using its serrated teeth, it would begin tearing away strips of flesh, eating the prey alive while it lay completely helpless, trapped beneath a perfectly designed biological machine. It is a hunting strategy that combines advanced neurological processing, perfectly overlapping stereoscopic vision, and highly specialized physical leverage, making the dromaeosaurids some of the most conceptually terrifying and perfectly adapted killers in the entire history of life on Earth. To truly grasp the absolute supremacy of the carnivorous dinosaurs, we must look beyond the open plains and the dense terrestrial forests. In the ruthless theatre of evolutionary biology, there is a concept known as the competitive exclusion principle. This biological law dictates that two different apex predators cannot occupy the exact same ecological niche in the exact same environment without one eventually driving the other to extinction. When multiple families of highly advanced, heavily armed biological killing machines evolved on the same continents, the competition for terrestrial prey reached a breaking point. To survive, and to continue their reign of terror, the theropod dinosaurs were forced into a profound evolutionary divergence. They initiated a lateral expansion, aggressively invading and conquering entirely new biomes that had previously been considered safe havens. They marched into the deep, treacherous waters of the prehistoric swamps, and they climbed into the dizzying heights of the forest canopy. No ecosystem on the face of the earth was safe. The conquest of the aquatic frontier was spearheaded by one of the most bizarre, terrifying, and profoundly specialized families of dinosaurs ever discovered, the Spinosauridae. When we examine the ancient river systems of Cretaceous North Africa, an area known to paleontologists as the Chem-Chem beds, we find an environment that was essentially a predator's nightmare. It was a sprawling, humid, mangrove-choked river delta, teeming with gigantic aquatic life, including massive prehistoric coelacanths the size of modern cars and sawfish possessing incredibly lethal spiked rostrums. To conquer this water world, the theropod blueprint had to be completely deconstructed and fundamentally re-engineered from the ground up, culminating in the colossal Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, the largest predatory dinosaur ever known, stretching over 15 meters in length and bearing a massive, imposing sail upon its back. The first major biomechanical hurdle the Spinosaurus had to overcome was the physics of the water itself. Liquid water is approximately 800 times denser than the air of the terrestrial atmosphere. A standard predatory dinosaur possessing a skeleton filled with massive biological air sacs and heavily pneumatic hollow bones would be dangerously buoyant. If a Tyrannosaurus or an Allosaurus attempted to swim into deep water to hunt, it would bob on the surface like a massive biological cork, completely unable to dive or maneuver effectively beneath the waves. Evolution solved this problem for the Spinosaurus by radically altering its bone density. Through a biological process known as osteosclerosis, the bones of the Spinosaurus lost their hollow cavities and became incredibly thick, solid, and immensely heavy. This extreme bone density acted as internal biological ballast, perfectly neutralizing the animal's natural buoyancy and allowing it to submerge itself completely and prowl beneath the surface of the massive river systems. Furthermore, the locomotive engine of the Spinosaurus was drastically modified. The massive, heavily muscled hind legs that propelled other theropods across the land were significantly shortened, deliberately shifting the animal's center of gravity forward to maintain stability in a horizontal swimming posture. But the most spectacular aquatic adaptation was its tail. Instead of a stiff rod-like counterbalance used for terrestrial running, the neural spines on the vertebrae of the Spinosaurus tail were massively elongated, creating a deep, flat, powerful structure remarkably similar to the paddle of a modern crested newt. By violently undulating this massive muscular paddle from side to side, the Spinosaurus generated immense forward thrust, displacing massive volumes of heavy water to propel its multi-ton body through the murky depths with terrifying silent grace. However, locating and capturing prey underwater presents an entirely different set of physical challenges. The jaws of a terrestrial apex predator are utterly useless in a dense liquid environment. A broad, heavy snout creates massive hydrodynamic drag. If a predator tries to snap a wide jaw shut underwater, the sheer physical force of the closing jaws pushes a massive wave of water forcefully out of the mouth, which physically blows the slippery prey completely out of the way before the teeth can even make contact. The Spinosaurids solved this hydrodynamic problem by evolving a skull that looked incredibly similar to a modern crocodilian gharial. The snout was astonishingly long, incredibly narrow, and fundamentally tubular, allowing it to slice through the dense water with practically zero hydrodynamic resistance. The teeth lining these specialized jaws were also completely transformed. The flat, serrated, flesh-slicing blades of the terrestrial killers were gone. Instead, the jaws of the Spinosaurus were armed with dozens of straight, completely conical, extremely sharp spikes that lacked any serrations whatsoever. These teeth were not meant for cutting. They were precision-engineered biological piercing pins. At the very tip of the snout, the upper jaw expanded outward into a bulbous circular shape known as a terminal rosette, and the teeth in this section projected outward at distinct angles. When the jaws slammed shut, the upper and lower teeth perfectly interlocked like a terrifying biological Iron Maiden. This mechanism was specifically designed to violently puncture and instantly lock down onto the slick, armor-plated scales of massive prehistoric fish, ensuring that no amount of violent, slippery thrashing could dislodge the prey. Yet, the most terrifying weapon in the Spinosaurus arsenal was entirely invisible to the naked eye, hidden deep within the bone of its elongated snout. The prehistoric river systems of the Kem beds were incredibly murky, choked with mud, vegetation and sediment. Visual targeting, the primary hunting method of terrestrial theropods, was completely useless in zero-visibility water. To hunt blind, the Spinosaurus evolved an unbelievably sophisticated biological sensor array. Paleontologists examining the fossilized skulls discovered that the very tip of the snout was riddled with a dense concentration of tiny, intricate holes, known scientifically as foramina. Through highly advanced digital scanning, scientists mapped the internal pathways of these holes and discovered that they connected directly to a massive centralized neurological hub deeply embedded within the skull, which in turn wired directly into the trigeminal nerve of the brain. In a living Spinosaurus, these tiny pits housed a complex network of highly sensitive mechanoreceptors. In the physics of fluid dynamics, whenever an object, such as a massive fish, moves through the water, it physically displaces the liquid around it, creating minute, invisible pressure waves that travel outward through the water column. The mechanoreceptors on the snout of the Spinosaurus were so hypersensitive that they could detect these microscopic fluctuations in water pressure. This meant that a Spinosaurus did not need to see its prey to kill it. The colossal predator could stand perfectly motionless in the deep river, completely submerging its long snout just beneath the muddy surface. The moment a fish swam past in the absolute darkness, the movement would send a tiny pressure wave rippling through the water. The mechanoreceptors would instantly register the exact direction, distance and magnitude of the wave, sending an electrical signal straight down the trigeminal nerve to the brain. In a fraction of a millisecond, the Spinosaurus would snap its highly aerodynamic jaws precisely onto the target. Through the combination of extreme biological ballast, hydrodynamic engineering, and a built-in neurological sonar system, the theropods completely conquered the aquatic realm, becoming the undisputed apex predators of the prehistoric rivers. Simultaneously, halfway across the world in the dense towering forests of prehistoric Asia, the theropod lineage was executing another, equally terrifying environmental takeover, the conquest of the vertical world. For tens of millions of years, the high canopy of the ancient forest provided a relatively safe sanctuary for small mammals, early lizards, and insects, far away from the massive ground-dwelling killers. But the relentless pressure of natural selection eventually drove a highly specialized offshoot of the dromaeosaurid family straight up into the trees. They shed the massive bulk of their terrestrial cousins, shrinking down to incredible extremes. The ultimate culmination of this arboreal evolution was Microraptor, an incredibly lethal, warm-blooded assassin that was no larger than a modern crow. To conquer the canopy, these tiny predators maximized the evolutionary potential of a biological structure that their larger terrestrial cousins used primarily for physical stabilization and temperature regulation: the feather. While the massive ground raptors possessed feathers, Microraptor possessed true, highly advanced aerodynamic flight feathers, completely indistinguishable from the feathers of modern flying birds. These structures were biomechanical masterpieces. A central, rigid shaft known as a rachis provided intense structural support, while a highly complex interlocking network of microscopic barbs and barbules created a perfectly solid, windproof surface area. Most importantly, the flight feathers of Microraptor were distinctly asymmetrical, meaning the leading edge of the feather was significantly narrower than the trailing edge. In the unforgiving physics of aerodynamics, this asymmetry is the absolute hallmark of aerodynamic capability. When moving rapidly through the air, an asymmetrical feather is structurally forced to twist slightly, naturally shedding air resistance and preventing the feather from simply buckling or spinning under the intense aerodynamic pressure. However, Microraptor did not just possess these advanced flight feathers on its front arms. It possessed a fully developed secondary set of aerodynamic wings on its hind legs as well, creating a spectacularly bizarre, four-winged biological design. This four-winged configuration indicates that Microraptor was not capable of sustained, powered, flapping flight from the ground up, like a modern pigeon or eagle. Its chest musculature was not massive enough to generate the raw horsepower required to continually fight gravity. Instead, Microraptor was the ultimate apex predator of the ambush glide. It used its sharp, curved claws to scale the massive trunks of the towering coniferous trees, disappearing into the dense foliage of the upper canopy. From this elevated, completely hidden vantage point, it utilized its highly advanced, stereoscopic binocular vision to scan the forest floor and the lower branches for any signs of movement from primitive mammals or smaller reptiles. When a target was acquired, the Microraptor executed a terrifying silent strike. It would hurl its body off the high branch and plunge toward the earth. Instantly, it would extend its arms and its legs outward, deploying all 4 of its heavily feathered wings. The physics of this maneuver were incredibly precise. By manipulating the angle of its 4 wings, the Microraptor created a massive surface area relative to its tiny body mass. As it fell, the air violently rushed over the curved upper surfaces of the wings faster than it moved across the flat lower surfaces. This difference in air velocity created a distinct zone of low pressure above the dinosaur, generating immense aerodynamic lift. This lift effectively neutralized the terrifying acceleration of gravity. The plummeting fall was instantly transformed into a highly controlled, incredibly rapid, and utterly silent glide. Because it had 4 distinct aerodynamic surfaces to manipulate independently, the Microraptor possessed a degree of in-air maneuverability that modern gliders can only dream of. It could subtly adjust the angle of its hind legs to execute razor-sharp, hairpin turns mid-air, perfectly tracking the erratic movements of a fleeing prey animal below. The victim on the forest floor would have absolutely no warning. There would be no heavy footsteps vibrating the ground, no snapping of twigs, and no massive shadow approaching from the brush. The death blow would simply materialize completely out of thin air. The tiny 4-winged assassin would drop from the sky, slamming into the prey with a flurry of needle-sharp teeth and razor-like sickle claws, utilizing the exact same grappling and pinning mechanics as its massive terrestrial cousins, just scaled down for precision canopy combat. By weaponizing the physics of aerodynamics, the theropod dinosaurs proved that they were not merely bound to the 2-dimensional plane of the Earth. From the crushing depths of the murky rivers to the dizzying heights of the forest canopy, they infiltrated, adapted to, and utterly dominated every conceivable ecological niche on the planet, leaving absolutely nowhere for their prey to hide. While the southern continents were being terrorized by the massive flesh-slicing Carcharodontosaurids and the high-speed Abelisaurids, the isolated northern landmass of Laurasia was charting an entirely different evolutionary course. Here, the arms race between predator and prey reached its absolute terrifying zenith roughly 66 million years ago, culminating in a creature that has transcended science to become a global cultural icon. However, the Hollywood depictions of this animal often reduce it to a roaring movie monster, which is a profound disservice to the reality of its existence. When you strip away the cinematic myths and look exclusively at the fossilized biomechanics, Tyrannosaurus Rex stands completely alone. It was not merely a dinosaur, it was the most perfectly engineered, overwhelmingly powerful biological killing machine to ever walk the surface of the Earth. To understand why Tyrannosaurus Rex represents the absolute apex of carnivorous evolution, we must analyze its defining feature, a skull and jaw apparatus designed for the express purpose of catastrophic structural demolition. To fully comprehend the evolutionary necessity of the Tyrannosaurus weapon system, one must first look at the prey it was hunting in the dense forests and floodplains of late Cretaceous North America. Unlike the massive, slow-moving, relatively unarmored sauropods of the southern hemisphere, the herbivores of Laurasia had evolved into walking fortresses. The ecosystem was dominated by ceratopsians, such as the legendary Triceratops, which wielded massive solid bone skull frills and lethal facial horns. The landscape was also shared with ankylosaurs, living biological tanks covered from head to tail in dense, overlapping plates of solid bone known as osteoderms. If a predator equipped with thin, serrated shark-like teeth attempted to deliver a high-speed slashing bite to a Triceratops or an Ankylosaurus, the result would be instantly disastrous for the attacker. The thin teeth would violently shatter against the dense bone armour, rendering the predator completely toothless and effectively condemning it to death by starvation. The environment demanded a radically new paradigm of predation. It demanded a predator that did not circumvent armour, but was specifically engineered to crush entirely through it. Evolution answered this demand with the skull of Tyrannosaurus Rex, measuring over 1.5 meters in length, and built with the heavy, blocky proportions of a bank vault. This skull fundamentally broke all the rules of previous theropod design. When paleontologists and biomechanical engineers apply finite element analysis to digital models of the Tyrannosaurus skull, the exact same complex computer simulations used by the aerospace industry to test the structural integrity of jet engine turbines and airplane fuselages under extreme stress, the results are nothing short of breathtaking. Earlier predators like Allosaurus possessed lightweight skulls with highly flexible joints to absorb the shock of a strike. Tyrannosaurus Rex sacrificed almost all of this flexibility in favour of absolute, unyielding rigidity. The bones along the top of its snout, known as the nasals, were completely fused together into a solid, impenetrable arch of thick bone. This structural fusion is a masterclass in biological engineering. When a Tyrannosaurus clamped its jaws shut on a struggling multi-ton heavily armoured prey animal, the rotational and torsional forces generated were astronomically high. A flexible skull would have violently twisted and snapped under the unimaginable physical stress. The fused nasals acted as a colossal biological shock absorber and force distributor, channeling the massive kinetic energy of the struggling prey away from the delicate brain case and safely down through the massive neck muscles. Furthermore, the back of the skull was incredibly wide, giving the Tyrannosaurus a distinct U-shaped snout, as opposed to the narrow V-shaped snouts of other predators. This widened architecture drastically increased the surface area of the front of the mouth, allowing the animal to grip massive struggling targets with unparalleled stability, completely preventing the prey from tearing sideways out of its jaws. However, a heavily reinforced skull is useless without the biological engine necessary to drive it. The back of the Tyrannosaurus skull featured massively expanded openings called temporal fenestrae. These vast hollow chambers served one singular purpose: to act as the anchor points for the most massive jaw muscles ever possessed by any terrestrial animal. The sheer volume of the adductor muscles, the biological cables responsible for pulling the lower jaw upward and snapping the mouth shut, was staggering. When biomechanical physicists calculated the lever mechanics of the jaw joint and combined it with the estimated cross-sectional area of these colossal muscle bundles, they arrived at a figure that completely redefines our understanding of biological power. A fully grown Tyrannosaurus Rex could generate a maximum bite force of up to 35,000 newtons. To put that catastrophic mathematical figure into perspective, it is roughly equivalent to the entire gravitational weight of 3 small cars being concentrated and dropped onto a single point. It is more than twice the bite force of the largest modern saltwater crocodiles, and utterly dwarfs the bite force of any other known carnivorous dinosaur. But the generation of force is only half of the physical equation. To inflict maximum biological devastation, that immense pressure must be successfully transferred into the target without the weapon itself breaking. This brings us to the teeth of the Tyrant King. A Tyrannosaurus did not possess the flat, blade-like, flesh-slicing teeth of its southern cousins. Instead, its jaws were lined with up to 60 massive, heavily robust teeth that paleontologists often compare to lethal bananas. These teeth were thick, incredibly deeply rooted, and fundamentally circular in their cross-section. While they still possessed serrations for cutting meat, their primary structural design was for armor piercing. The roots of these teeth were absolutely massive, often extending deeper into the jawbone than the exposed crown itself. This deep anchoring system ensured that when the 35,000 newtons of force were applied, the teeth would not be leveraged out of their sockets by the violent thrashing of a 5-ton Triceratops. When a Tyrannosaurus launched an attack, it did not rely on the graceful, hit-and-run, flesh-slicing tactics of the Carcharodontosaurids. It relied on overwhelming brute force trauma. The predator would charge into close-quarters combat, utilizing its massive bulk, weighing up to 8 metric tons, to physically body-check its armored prey. Once in range, it would open its massive jaws and clamp down directly onto the thickest, most heavily defended sections of the victim. This is where the terrifying phenomenon of extreme osteophagy, or bone-eating, occurred. When the thick spike-like teeth of the Tyrannosaurus made contact with the solid bone of its prey, the incredible physics of point-loading pressure took over. The 35,000 newtons of force were concentrated instantly onto the relatively small surface area of the tooth tips. The solid bone of the prey simply could not withstand this astronomical mechanical stress. The structural integrity of the bone would instantly fail, violently shattering and splintering under the immense localized pressure. The teeth of the Tyrannosaurus would punch cleanly through the thick hide, through the dense layers of muscle, and straight through the solid skeletal framework of the victim, essentially acting as a row of biological pile drivers. Once the jaws were locked and the teeth were buried deep into the shattered bones of the prey, the Tyrannosaurus executed the final, most violent phase of its attack. Anchored to the back of its massive fused skull was a complex network of impossibly thick hypertrophied neck muscles. With its jaws securely clamped onto a massive section of the victim's body, the predator would violently throw its massive head backward and upward. Because the teeth were so deeply embedded and the jaws were locked with inescapable force, this explosive backward motion did not simply tear away the flesh. It violently ripped entire massive sections of the prey's body completely free. Muscle, connective tissue, and solid, shattered bone were all effortlessly torn away in a single catastrophic mechanical action. The biological evidence for this bone-crushing capability is not purely theoretical. It is permanently recorded in the fossil record. Paleontologists have unearthed the fossilized pelvis bones of a Triceratops bearing massive, deep puncture wounds that perfectly match the shape and spacing of Tyrannosaurus teeth, indicating a bite so powerful it punched directly through the thickest bone in the herbivore's body. Furthermore, scientists have discovered rare, perfectly preserved coprolites, fossilized dinosaur feces, that are undeniably attributed to Tyrannosaurus Rex. When placed under a microscope, these coprolites are packed with thousands of tiny jagged shards of pulverized bone. This confirms that Tyrannosaurus Rex did not gently pick the meat off the carcasses of its prey. It possessed a highly specialized, intensely acidic digestive system, capable of dissolving and processing solid bone. This granted the apex predator a massive nutritional advantage. While other predators were forced to leave the skeleton behind, the Tyrannosaurus could consume the entire carcass, extracting the highly nutritious, calorie-dense bone marrow and vital minerals hidden deep within the skeletal framework. This level of extreme anatomical specialization proves that Tyrannosaurus Rex was not just a hunter. It was an unparalleled engine of biological demolition. It represents the ultimate conclusion of the predatory arms race, a masterwork of structural engineering, bite force physics, and armor-piercing dentition that reigned completely unchallenged at the very top of the prehistoric food chain. The catastrophic bite force and armor-crushing dentition of Tyrannosaurus Rex represent the ultimate physical weaponry of the prehistoric world. However, in the unforgiving theatre of evolutionary biology, a weapon of massive destructive power is entirely useless if it cannot be accurately delivered to its target. To truly understand why the Tyrant King was the undisputed apex of carnivorous evolution, we must look beyond the mechanics of its jaws and examine the neurological command center that directed them. For decades, popular cinema perpetuated one of the most egregious scientific inaccuracies in modern media. the myth that Tyrannosaurus Rex possessed vision based on movement, and that if a prey animal stood perfectly still, it would become practically invisible. This cinematic trope is not just incorrect, it is the exact opposite of the biological reality. Tyrannosaurus Rex possessed one of the most sophisticated, hypersensitive, and neurologically advanced sensory arrays in the history of terrestrial life. It was a biological machine equipped with perfectly integrated targeting sensors, boasting visual acuity that dwarfed modern birds of prey, and an olfactory system that turned the entire Cretaceous landscape into an inescapable chemical map. To comprehend the terrifying supremacy of Tyrannosaurus vision, we must first examine the architectural engineering of its massive skull from a head-on perspective. In most predatory dinosaurs, such as the Jurassic Allosaurus or the southern Carcharodontosaurids, the skull is relatively narrow and tapers to a wedge at the snout. Consequently, their eyes were positioned on the sides of their heads. While this provided a wide field of peripheral vision, the snout physically blocked their line of sight, creating a massive blind spot directly in front of their noses. Tyrannosaurus Rex fundamentally shattered this design paradigm. The back of its skull was immensely widened, while the snout remained relatively narrow, creating a distinct keyhole-shaped profile when viewed from the front. This specific cranial architecture physically pushed the eye sockets, or orbits, outward and oriented them strictly forward. Because the eyes were angled forward and the snout was kept out of the visual pathway, the visual fields of the right and left eyes overlapped to an extraordinary degree. This overlap is the neurological prerequisite for binocular or stereoscopic vision. When the brain receives two slightly different visual inputs from the same object, it mathematically synthesizes them to calculate precise depth, distance, and three-dimensional volume. Humans possess an effective binocular overlap of roughly 120 degrees. A modern hawk, highly renowned for its precision targeting, possesses a binocular overlap of approximately 20 degrees. Paleontologists calculating the orbital orientation of Tyrannosaurus Rex discovered that it possessed a binocular overlap of up to 55 degrees. This granted the massive predator a highly refined, perfectly integrated three-dimensional view of its world, allowing it to instantly and flawlessly calculate the exact distance to a heavily armoured Triceratops, ensuring its bone-crushing strike never missed its mark. But depth perception is only one component of visual supremacy. The true terror of the Tyrannosaurus eye lies in its sheer resolving power or visual acuity. The physical size of an eyeball directly correlates to its optical capabilities. A larger eyeball permits a wider pupil, which gathers vastly more light, and it allows for a massively expanded retina, the light-sensitive tissue at the back of the eye. The orbits of a fully grown Tyrannosaurus Rex were incredibly vast, capable of housing eyeballs the size of large grapefruits or softballs. Because the focal length of the optical lens was so immense, the image projected onto the retina was drastically magnified. Furthermore, this massive retinal surface area was densely packed with millions of microscopic photoreceptor cells. By analysing the size of the optic nerve passageways preserved in fossilised brain cases, neuropaleontologists have been able to mathematically estimate the visual acuity of this prehistoric giant. The results are profoundly humbling for mammalian biology. Visual acuity is scientifically measured in cycles per degree, a metric that calculates how finely an eye can distinguish parallel lines before they blur together. A human with perfect vision maxes out at roughly 60 cycles per degree. A modern eagle, nature's current gold standard for biological optics, possesses an acuity of up to 140 cycles per degree, allowing it to spot a small rabbit from hundreds of meters high. The calculations for Tyrannosaurus Rex suggest a visual acuity that could have been up to 13 times greater than that of a human. This means that a Tyrannosaurus Rex was essentially viewing the world through highly advanced biological telephoto lenses. While a human might struggle to clearly identify a large animal from a kilometre away, a Tyrannosaurus Rex could clearly resolve the exact shape, species, and directional movement of a target from up to 6 kilometres away. It could stand on an elevated ridge and visually scan the prehistoric floodplains, locking onto a herd of distant herbivores long before those animals possessed any indication that they were being watched. Moreover, the massive size of the pupil meant that this optical supremacy was not limited to broad daylight. The light-gathering capability of the Tyrannosaurus eye strongly indicates that it possessed exceptional night vision. It could effortlessly navigate the dense, towering conifer forests in the dead of night, or during the twilight hours of dawn and dusk, launching devastating ambushes when its diurnal prey was most visually impaired and vulnerable. However, visual targeting requires an unobstructed line of sight. In the densely packed, overgrown jungles of late Cretaceous North America, visual contact was not always possible. A heavily armoured herbivore could camouflage itself within a thick grove of cycads or hide behind massive geological formations. To ensure that no prey could ever truly vanish, Tyrannosaurus Rex was equipped with a secondary sensory system that was equally, if not more, terrifying than its vision, an olfactory apparatus of incomprehensible sensitivity. The evidence for this chemical tracking system is locked entirely within the cranial cavity of the beast. When paleontologists utilize high-resolution medical computed tomography scanners to map the interior of a perfectly preserved Tyrannosaurus brain case, they create a highly detailed three-dimensional digital cast of the brain, known as an endocast. The dinosaur brain was essentially a long tubular structure, relatively similar to modern reptilian and avian brains. But the absolute most shocking revelation of the Tyrannosaurus endocast is the sheer, disproportionate volume of the olfactory bulbs. The olfactory bulbs are the specialized neurological centers located at the very front of the brain, completely dedicated to receiving and processing the chemical signals of smell. In Tyrannosaurus Rex, these bulbs were hypertrophied to a spectacular extreme. They were absolutely massive, taking up a significantly larger percentage of the total brain volume than in almost any other known dinosaur, and completely dwarfing the olfactory centers of modern mammalian predators like wolves or lions. When comparative anatomists look for a modern biological equivalent to this brain structure, they do not look at hunting dogs. They look at the turkey vulture, a bird biologically engineered to detect the microscopic chemical signatures of rotting meat from kilometers up in the atmosphere. To feed these massive neurological processes, the physical architecture of the Tyrannosaurus nasal cavity was immensely expansive. As the dinosaur inhaled, massive volumes of air were drawn into the deep, cavernous chambers of its snout. Inside these chambers existed an incredibly complex labyrinthine network of delicate bones known as turbinates. In life, these bones were tightly wrapped in the olfactory epithelium, a highly specialized mucus-coated tissue absolutely packed with millions of microscopic chemical receptors. In the physics of olfaction, smell is not an abstract concept. It is the physical detection of microscopic airborne molecules. Every living, breathing animal constantly sheds physical particulate matter into the environment. A sweating, breathing, defecating herd of Edmontosaurus left a massive invisible chemical trail of pheromones, skin cells and biological waste in their wake. When these microscopic molecules drifted on the Cretaceous wind and entered the nasal cavity of the Tyrannosaurus, they became physically trapped in the moisture of the olfactory epithelium. The chemical receptors instantly bound to the molecules, sending massive surges of electrical data straight into the colossal olfactory bulbs. Because of the sheer neurological processing power dedicated to this sense, a Tyrannosaurus Rex could effectively see the world in a vivid, highly detailed chemical map. It could detect the scent of a wounded animal bleeding in the dense brush from kilometers away. It could analyze the chemical signature of a footprint and neurologically determine the exact direction the prey was moving, and potentially even how recently the animal had passed through. The environment was an open book of chemical information. This meant that the Tyrant King did not need to randomly wander the landscape hoping to stumble across food. It was a highly methodical, mathematically precise tracker. If a prey animal was injured, the scent of fresh blood in the wind would act as an inescapable invisible tether, drawing the 8-ton killer relentlessly toward its target through the darkest nights and the thickest forests. Furthermore, the integration of these supreme senses completely disproves the outdated and scientifically baseless theory that Tyrannosaurus Rex was exclusively a scavenger. While it absolutely would use its massive olfactory range to locate the free calories of a rotting carcass, as any highly efficient biological machine would, its sensory array was explicitly over-engineered for the ultimate hunt. A pure scavenger does not require forward-facing binocular vision to calculate the exact distance to a target, nor does it require visual acuity capable of resolving fine details from 6 kilometers away, because a dead carcass does not run away. The stereoscopic vision, the astronomical bite force, and the heavily fused, shock-absorbing skull are the undeniable hallmarks of an active, hyperlethal apex predator designed to engage and dismantle massive, living, heavily armoured prey. When you synthesize the biomechanical data, a chilling portrait of perfection emerges. Tyrannosaurus Rex was not a lumbering, mindless monster of the ancient world. It was a warm-blooded, highly active intelligence, deeply integrated into its environment through a sensory array that borders on science fiction. It could smell you from kilometers away, tracking the invisible chemical markers of your breath and sweat. Once it closed the distance, its binocular vision locked onto you with a resolution far surpassing that of an eagle, calculating the exact geometry of the strike. And when it finally attacked, it delivered 35,000 newtons of armor-piercing kinetic energy, obliterating flesh, shattering solid bone, and instantaneously ending the evolutionary arms race. Through the perfect harmonization of devastating mechanical weaponry and hyper-advanced neurological targeting systems, Tyrannosaurus Rex secured its eternal legacy as the most dangerous, perfectly adapted hunter to ever walk the planet. The reign of the carnivorous dinosaurs was a masterpiece of biological engineering, an epoch of terrestrial dominance that lasted for over 165 million years. From the razor-sharp, stress-dissipating teeth of the Jurassic apex hunters to the high-velocity ballistic impact of the southern Abelisaurids, and from the sophisticated pressure-sensing aquatic hunters of the chem beds to the bone-shattering hypervisual tyrant king of Laurasia, these animals successfully conquered every conceivable ecological niche on Earth. They were not primitive relics of a forgotten world. They were the absolute, inescapable peak of predatory evolution. Yet, even the most perfectly adapted biological machine cannot negotiate with the raw, chaotic violence of planetary geology. Roughly 66 million years ago, the era of the dinosaurs ended not because of an evolutionary failure, but due to a cataclysmic, extraterrestrial intervention. A massive asteroid, approximately 10 kilometers in diameter, slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of billions of atomic bombs. The immediate aftermath was an apocalyptic nightmare. Global firestorms, tsunamis of unimaginable magnitude, and an instantaneous injection of millions of tons of sulfur and particulate matter into the upper atmosphere. This impact winter plunged the planet into a deep, freezing darkness that lasted for years. The colossal herbivores, unable to find food, perished, and as the cascading collapse moved up the food chain, the great carnivorous empires vanished along with them. However, to claim that the dinosaurs went extinct is a fundamental misunderstanding of the evolutionary tree. While the non-avian dinosaurs, the massive beasts we have analysed, were wiped out, one specific lineage of the theropods had already undergone a radical transformation. Long before the asteroid struck, a group of small, feathered, hyper-intelligent hunters had begun to experiment with the aerodynamics of their plumage. They had refined their biology, reducing their mass and shifting their metabolism, eventually taking to the skies. They survived the impact by their sheer versatility, their ability to feed on insects, seeds, and small organisms in a world that had become inhospitable to giants. Today, we do not need to visit a museum to see a dinosaur. We merely need to look at the sky. Every raptor, every eagle, and every falcon soaring above us is a direct, living descendant of those ancient lethal theropods. The modern predatory bird is a flying manifestation of dinosaurian perfection. They retain the exact same unidirectional respiratory systems that allowed their ancestors to hunt for hours without fatigue. They possess the same hyper-advanced, stereoscopic vision that guided the raptors of the Cretaceous. When a golden eagle dives to strike its prey, it is performing the same sophisticated high-speed pinning and grappling predatory maneuver that the Dromaeosaurids mastered tens of millions of years ago. The spirit of the apex predator never left, it simply took flight. We have explored the physics of their serrated teeth, the mechanics of their hollow pneumatic bones, and the incredible sensory arrays that allowed them to dominate a world of giants. We have seen how the laws of natural selection and biomechanical engineering can forge a creature that remains the standard for lethal efficiency to this day. The story of the dinosaurs is not just a tale of the past, it is the fundamental study of what it means to be a predator. It teaches us about the resilience of life, the relentless pressure of evolutionary adaptation, and the terrifying beauty of biological optimization. Thank you for joining us on this deep scientific dive into the prehistoric world. If you found this exploration of evolutionary perfection fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel to ensure you do not miss our upcoming investigations into the wonders of our natural history. Before you head out, drop a comment below and let us know exactly where you are in the world and what time it is while you are watching this. We love hearing from our community across the globe. Until next time, keep exploring the mysteries of the deep past.